The jungle does not look like a cemetery. It breathes, drips, grows, and moves in every direction. But beneath its roots lie roads, reservoirs, temples, and cities that once held thousands of lives. These were not small forgotten villages. They were kingdoms of water, stone, earth, and power, swallowed slowly by rain, time, and silence. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, because under these leaves, the past is still waiting. The jungle does not look like a cemetery at first. It looks alive in every possible direction, crowded with green, dripping with heat, restless with insects, birds, vines, leaves, and roots that twist over one another as if the forest has been growing forever. But beneath that moving skin of life, there are stones that were once cut by human hands. There are stairways going nowhere, causeways swallowed by moss, walls split open by trees, and buried platforms where kings once stood above crowds that have long since vanished from memory. A person walking through such a forest may step over a collapsed palace without knowing it. A mound may look like a natural hill until the angle of its slope becomes too precise. A pool of dark water may seem like a swamp until its edges reveal an ancient reservoir, engineered in a time when this place was not wilderness, but a kingdom. The forgotten kingdoms beneath the jungle are not forgotten because they were small. Many were immense. They shaped rivers, carved roads through forests, raised temples above the canopy, built water systems that could support tens or hundreds of thousands of people, and turned difficult tropical landscapes into centers of power. They had rulers, farmers, priests, merchants, soldiers, architects, potters, astronomers, boatmen, laborers, and children growing up beneath roofs that are now dust. Yet the forest has a way of making even grandeur disappear. Rain falls year after year. Seeds settle into cracks. Roots enter stone like slow fingers. Wood rots. Plaster melts. Painted surfaces fade. And the air itself seems to digest whatever people leave behind. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the story waiting under these leaves is not simply about ruins. It's about how entire worlds can be hidden in plain sight. To understand the mystery, it helps to imagine the jungle not as an empty background, but as an active force. In temperate places, ruins may stand exposed for centuries, their broken columns visible across open fields or dry hills. In tropical forests, time works differently. A temple can vanish beneath vegetation within generations. A road can become a line of slightly raised ground. A canal can fill with silt, leaves, and stagnant water until it looks like a natural depression. The evidence remains incomplete, because the same conditions that feed life also destroy many traces of human life. Organic materials vanish quickly. Wooden buildings collapse into soil. Cloth, baskets, painted bark, food remains, and many everyday objects rarely survive unless protected by unusual conditions. What endures most often is stone, earth, ceramic, charcoal, altered soils, and the strange geometry that human effort leaves behind. This is why so many jungle kingdoms have been misunderstood. For a long time, outsiders looking at tropical forests imagined them as timeless wilderness, places where nature stood untouched before modern intrusion. That idea is now known to be deeply misleading. In Central America, in Southeast Asia, in parts of the Amazon, in Sri Lanka, in Africa, and across many monsoon and rainforest regions. The green world often grows over older human landscapes. Some forests are not the opposite of civilization. They are, in part, its afterlife. Certain tree species cluster where people once planted, protected, or encouraged them. Some soils are darker and richer because generations of people changed them with ash, food waste, pottery fragments, and organic matter. Some animal paths follow ancient embankments. Some modern villages sit near older settlements whose names have faded, while local memory preserves hints that scholars only later begin to understand. There is something almost unsettling about how quietly this happens. A city does not need to be buried by a volcano to disappear. It does not need a tidal wave or a single dramatic day of fire. Sometimes it only needs abandonment, rain, and enough time. A royal court loses authority. Trade routes shift. Reservoirs fail or are no longer maintained. Warfare makes farming unsafe. Drought presses against already strained systems. People leave by choice, by force, or because survival begins to look easier somewhere else. The buildings remain for a while. Then the roofs go. Then the walls slump. Then birds drop seeds in the cracks, and saplings rise from the rooms of the dead. After a few centuries, the same place that once rang with tools, ceremonies, markets, and human voices becomes a hill of roots. Yet disappearance is not the same as total erasure. The jungle hides, but it also preserves outlines. In some places, enormous stone temples still break through the canopy, their towers rising above the trees like stranded mountains. In other places, the signs are more subtle, a straight line where nature prefers curves, a cluster of mounds too regular to be accidental, a ditch where no stream should run, a patch of unusually fertile soil, a shard of pottery turned up by rain. Archaeologists learn to read these signals the way trackers read footprints. They look at the height of a mound, the shape of a terrace, the chemistry of earth, the distribution of broken ceramics, the pollen sealed in lake mud, the charcoal left by ancient fires, and the way water once moved through a landscape that has changed around it. One of the surprising details about jungle ruins is that they are often most visible from above, even when they are nearly invisible on the ground. A person standing in dense forest may see only trunks and leaves a few meters ahead, but from the air, patterns begin to emerge. Long before modern laser scanning, pilots, surveyors, and explorers sometimes noticed lines, ridges, or temple tops rising from the green. Today, technologies that can measure the ground beneath vegetation have revealed roads, platforms, reservoirs, fields, and entire settlement patterns that were almost impossible to grasp by walking alone. The discovery is not only that there are ruins in the forest, it is that some forest cover landscapes far more densely built and carefully organized than many earlier scholars expected. Still, technology does not remove the mystery. It often deepens it. Once a hidden city appears on a map, harder questions follow. How many people lived there? How did they feed themselves? Who ruled them? Why did their systems endure for centuries? And why did they fail? Were they destroyed by drought, war, political breakdown, disease, invasion, rebellion, changing trade, spiritual transformation, or some combination that cannot be reduced to one cause? No single explanation fully accounts for these histories. A collapsed kingdom is rarely a simple puzzle with one missing piece. It is more like a woven fabric coming apart thread by thread, until later generations see only fragments and try to imagine the pattern. The jungle also complicates the human story because it can make abandonment look like annihilation. A city may fall, but people do not always vanish. They migrate, reorganize, marry into other communities, preserve rituals, change languages, adapt to new landscapes, or return seasonally to places that outsiders think are empty. Some descendants of these ancient societies still live near the ruins, though their histories have often been ignored, distorted, or pushed aside by conquest and colonial storytelling. What survives in the record suggests that many so-called lost kingdoms were not lost to everyone. They were lost to maps, to imperial archives, to foreign scholars, and sometimes to the political memory of later states. But local people often knew of stones beneath roots, sacred hills, old paths, and places where the past remained present in quieter ways. That is the first lesson the forest offers. The green wall is not silence, it is a cover. Beneath it lie cities that rose from ambition and necessity, from faith and labour, from clever engineering and human vulnerability. Their ruins wait in shade, not as dead curiosities, but as warnings and reminders. Civilizations can master landscapes for a time, yet they are never separate from them. Water must still arrive, soil must still hold, roads must still be cleared. Power must still convince people to build, repair, obey, and believe. When those bonds weaken, the forest is patient. It does not need to conquer in a hurry. It only waits for the hands that once held it back to disappear. A forest remembers differently from stone. It does not keep history in straight lines, clean dates, or walls that remain obediently upright. It keeps history in distortions. A ridge rises where the land should be flat. A cluster of useful trees grows in a place too convenient to be accidental. A patch of soil turns dark, rich, and stubbornly fertile while the surrounding earth remains thin and acidic. A stream bends around an embankment made by people who have been gone for centuries. To the untrained eye, these details seem like ordinary jungle disorder, but to someone who has learned to read them, they are fragments of old decisions. The forest is not simply covering the past. In strange and uneven ways, it is carrying the past forward. This is one of the great difficulties in studying kingdoms beneath tropical vegetation. The jungle is both destroyer and archive. It breaks buildings apart with moisture, heat, insects, fungi, and roots. Yet it also protects some traces by sealing them away from later farming, quarrying, and urban rebuilding. In open landscapes, ruins can be dismantled and reused stone by stone. Roads may be ploughed under. Ancient walls may be absorbed into newer towns. But in dense forest, abandonment can sometimes freeze a landscape beneath vegetation, preserving the shape of a city even after its buildings have lost their faces. What survives may not be the city as its people saw it, but the bones of its layout remain the raised road, the temple mound, the reservoir basin, the terrace edge, the old drainage line, the neighborhood platform. The visible ruin is often only the most obvious part of the buried kingdom. A temple rising from the trees can draw the eye, but the real city may stretch far beyond it, low and quiet beneath the canopy. Monumental architecture tends to survive because it was built to impress, to endure, and to gather power around itself. Ordinary houses, workshops, kitchens, fences, garden plots, wooden shrines, and market stalls usually disappear. That creates a dangerous illusion for generations. Some archaeologists and travellers saw jungle ruins as isolated ceremonial centres, places where priests and kings appeared for rituals while the real population lived elsewhere in scattered villages. In some cases, that interpretation underestimated the density and complexity of these ancient landscapes. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives in the record suggests that many forest-covered sites were not lonely monuments. They were living urban systems, surrounded by work, food, noise, and ordinary human problems. The materials of the tropics are partly responsible for the silence. Wood is strong while it is alive and useful while it is maintained, but after abandonment it becomes food for the forest. Thatch vanishes, woven walls vanish, painted plaster flakes away, textiles, mats, ropes, baskets, and many tools decay until almost nothing remains. Even human bones can disappear in acidic soils unless conditions are favourable. This means that the most common objects of daily life may leave the faintest signatures. Archaeologists often have to reconstruct whole worlds from pottery fragments, post holes, stains in the earth, stone tools, food residues, and the chemistry of floors. A palace of timber can leave less behind than a broken cooking pot. A community that lived mostly in perishable structures may look poorer, simpler, or smaller than it really was. Not because it lacked complexity, but because the forest has eaten the evidence. Yet the forest cannot erase geometry easily. Human beings build in patterns. They make right angles, repeated terraces, straight alignments, ordered plazas, embankments, causeways, and channels that move water with intention. Even after centuries, those patterns can remain as shadows in the land. A road may survive as a slightly raised strip because compacted fill drains differently from surrounding soil. A canal may survive as a damp depression where different plants grow. An ancient field system may appear as ridges and troughs under grass, swamp, or secondary growth. A defensive ditch may become a line of greener vegetation. Terraces cut into slopes can outlast the houses they supported, even if their stone facings collapse. In this way, a vanished kingdom becomes a kind of hidden drawing, not on paper, but pressed into the ground itself. One lesser-known clue comes from trees. Some tropical forests contain what researchers call cultural forests, places where the mix of species has been influenced by long human use. People plant fruit trees, protect useful palms, encourage medicinal plants, transport seeds, clear competitors, burn selectively, and enrich soil around settlements. Centuries later, these choices can echo in the vegetation. A grove may not be proof of a city by itself, but when useful trees cluster near old mounds, dark earth, pottery scatters, or earthworks, the pattern becomes harder to dismiss. In some regions, the forest that appears wild may partly descend from gardens, orchards, managed groves, and fallows. The jungle does not merely grow over the ancient world, sometimes it grows from it. Soils can remember even more quietly. In many tropical zones, heavy rain leaches nutrients from the ground, leaving soils that are difficult for long-term intensive farming. Yet archaeologists have found patches of unusually fertile dark earth in places associated with ancient settlement. These soils can contain charcoal, bone fragments, pottery, ash, food waste, and organic matter built up through generations of occupation. They are not spectacular like temples, but they may be more revealing. A temple shows where power was displayed. Soil shows where people cooked, ate, discarded, planted, burned, repaired, and returned day after day. The surprising thing is that some human-made or human-enriched soils remain productive long after the societies that formed them have changed or disappeared. In such places, the land still benefits from hands no one can name. Water also leaves memory behind. In humid forests, it may seem strange to speak of water as a problem, because rain can be overwhelming. But tropical rain is often seasonal, violent, and difficult to store. Too much water at one time can flood fields and damage buildings. Too little at another can threaten crops and cities. Ancient kingdoms learned to shape water through reservoirs, canals, dikes, ponds, moats, drains, raised fields, and wetlands management. When these systems are maintained, they can turn uncertain landscapes into centres of abundance. When they fail, they become hazards. A clogged canal can redirect floods. A neglected reservoir can silt up. A broken embankment can destroy the fields it once protected. Scholars still debate the exact role of water failure in many ancient collapses, but again and again, hidden jungle landscapes show that political power and hydraulic labour were closely tied. The forest preserves consequences as much as achievements. A city that overuses nearby soils may leave erosion deposits in lowlands. A population that clears slopes may leave traces of sediment in lakes. Fires lit for farming, cooking, warfare, or renewal may leave charcoal locked in layers of mud. Pollen grains can reveal shifts from forest to fields and back again. Tiny remains of maize, rice, tubers, palms, or other plants can show how people fed themselves. These clues are small, almost invisible, yet together they can overturn old assumptions. They show that the jungle is not a blank curtain pulled over history. It is a layered record, one that must be read through mud, seeds, slopes, stains, and absences. Still, caution is necessary. Not every mound is a temple, not every straight line is a road, and not every unusual plant cluster proves ancient design. Tropical landscapes are dynamic on their own. Trees fall, rivers shift, animals dig, storms rearrange hillsides, and roots create forms that can deceive even experienced observers. Popular stories often rush toward lost cities, treasure chambers, and vanished races. But responsible archaeology moves more slowly. It asks whether a shape is natural or built, whether artifacts are present, whether dates match, whether multiple forms of evidence support the same interpretation. No single clue is enough. A forgotten kingdom emerges only when many clues begin to point in the same direction. And when they do, the effect is quietly astonishing. The forest ceases to be only scenery. It becomes a manuscript written in living matter and broken ground. Roads lie under roots. Reservoirs hold green water beneath lilies. Terraces step down slopes where farmers once watched the rain. Temple stones press upward through soil, while the trees above them feed on centuries of fallen leaves. The jungle has not kept these kingdoms unchanged, and it has not treated them gently. It has crushed, dissolved, buried, and transformed them. But transformation is not the same as forgetting. Beneath the leaves, the old landscapes remain, waiting for someone patient enough to notice that nature, too, can have a memory. The first clearing in the mystery is not made by a machete alone. It begins in the mind. At the moment someone realizes that the wall of green ahead is not merely wild growth, but a cover over older human order. For centuries, travellers entering tropical forest carried assumptions with them as heavy as their supplies. Some imagined the jungle as a place outside history, a realm where nature had always ruled and where human settlement could only have been thin, temporary, or primitive. Others came searching for treasure, conquest, timber, souls, maps, or glory, and saw ruins only through the narrow frame of their own ambitions. Yet the forest had already been known by the people who lived near it. Local guides knew paths through the trees, old stones beside streams, sacred hills, buried walls, carved fragments, and mounds where no ordinary hill should be. The later fame often went to foreign explorers, but many discoveries began with knowledge that was already there. This is one of the uncomfortable truths behind the story of jungle archaeology. The first people to notice the ruins were usually not the ones who wrote the books. Farmers found carved stones while clearing land. Hunters passed broken stairways. Monks, villagers, forest communities, and indigenous families preserved names, legends, warnings, and practical roots. A temple swallowed by roots might be famous to nearby communities long before it appeared on a colonial map. What changed was not always discovery in the pure sense, but translation into the language of archives, museums, survey reports, and scholarly institutions. What survives in the record often reflects who had the power to publish, collect, name, remove, and claim. Scholars today increasingly recognize this, though the older stories of heroic rediscovery still linger in popular imagination. In the 19th century, as European and American travelers pushed deeper into forests across Central America, South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia, accounts of jungle ruins began to circulate with a force that fascinated the public. Some reports were careful, others were embroidered with a romance. Broken cities in the trees seemed to confirm every fantasy of lost races and vanished empires. Drawings and engravings carried images of temples wrapped in vines to readers who would never feel the heat, disease, mud, or exhaustion of those expeditions. The jungle became a stage on which the ancient world appeared as a dramatic ruin, stripped of its living descendants and turned into mystery. It made for powerful storytelling, but it also distorted the past. Early explorers often worked under brutal conditions. They moved through forests where visibility could shrink to a few steps, where equipment rotted, insects swarmed, rivers flooded suddenly, and fever could end an expedition faster than any lack of courage. To reveal a building, teams sometimes had to cut away trees, vines, and layers of growth that had fused with masonry. In many cases, clearing the vegetation damaged the very monuments people hoped to study. Roots held walls together even as they broke them apart. Remove the tree too quickly, and the stones could collapse. The forest was not simply an obstacle to the ruin. It had become part of the ruin's structure, a living scaffolding around a dead architecture. The early written reports are full of this tension between wonder and misunderstanding. A traveller might describe a carved monument with awe, yet have little sense of the society that made it. A surveyor might map a temple and miss the settlement around it. A collector might remove sculpture from its landscape, turning a sacred or political object into an isolated museum piece. In some places, monuments were cut apart, shipped away, sold, or used as proof of theories that now seem deeply flawed. There were serious observers, skilled artists, and careful recorders among these pioneers, but there were also looters, opportunists, and men who could not imagine that ancestors of nearby people had built such places. No single explanation fully accounts for the strange mixture of curiosity, admiration, prejudice, and extraction that mark the first age of jungle rediscovery. A surprising detail is how often the greatest obstacle was not finding ruins, but believing their scale. A stone temple in the jungle was one thing. An entire urban world beneath the canopy was harder to accept. If a traveller saw a pyramid rising from trees, he could imagine a ceremonial monument. If he walked a short distance and found another mound, then another, then a causeway, then a reservoir, then carved stones scattered over kilometres, the implications became unsettling. These were not isolated shrines in empty forest. They suggested labour forces, political organisation, food production, engineering, and continuity across generations. They suggested that the landscape itself had once been planned, yet without modern mapping tools, the full pattern was nearly impossible to grasp. The forest broke the city into fragments, and the human mind tends to underestimate what it cannot see all at once. This problem shaped early interpretations across the tropical world. At Angkor, towers and temples stood as undeniable evidence of grandeur, but the larger city remained difficult to imagine beneath rice fields, forest, villages, and waterworks. In the Maya lowlands, magnificent centres emerged from the canopy. Yet for a long time scholars debated whether they were true cities, ritual centres, royal capitals, or something in between. In the Amazon, the challenge was even greater, because many societies built with earth and wood rather than durable stone. Their traces were lower, subtler, easier to dismiss as natural features or minor occupation. The evidence remains incomplete, and it took generations of fieldwork before the old idea of an untouched tropical wilderness began to break apart. Archaeological pioneers slowly learned that a jungle ruin cannot be understood as a single monument. It must be read as part of a landscape. A temple stands where it stands for reasons: water, visibility, sacred geography, political control, trade movement, memory, defense, or inherited tradition. A causeway connects places that once mattered to each other. A reservoir implies labor, maintenance, planning, and seasonal anxiety. A field system implies not only food, but rights to land, rhythms of planting, and the pressure of mouths to feed. A carved monument names power, but a scatter of pottery may reveal where food was cooked and families lived. The grand stone face is only one layer. The kingdom lies in the relationship between all the traces. This shift from treasure hunting to landscape archaeology was slow and uneven. It required better maps, longer excavations, more respect for local knowledge, and a willingness to see ordinary evidence as meaningful. It also required humility. The jungle does not reward hurried certainty. A mound that looks like a palace may prove to be a platform for houses. A sacred site may have been rebuilt many times. A city may not have had clear edges at all, fading into gardens, fields, and smaller settlements. Scholars still debate how to define urbanism in some tropical regions, because these places do not always match familiar models built from stone streets and compact city walls. Their order may be dispersed, green, watery, and difficult to separate from the surrounding environment. By the early 20th century, the picture had begun to change. Expeditions became more systematic. Survey grids replaced some of the older wandering. Ceramic sequences helped build timelines. Inscriptions, where they existed, began to speak more clearly. Excavations moved beyond temples into houses, workshops, terraces, and reservoirs. The jungle was no longer merely a veil hiding monuments. It was becoming evidence in itself. The question was no longer simply what ruins stood beneath the trees, but how entire societies had lived with those trees, controlled them, feared them, used them, and finally left enough behind for the forest to close again. The first clearing, then, is not a moment when the jungle is defeated. It is a moment when the old assumption of emptiness begins to fail. Behind the vines are not just stones, but histories of observation, erasure, rediscovery, and correction. The kingdoms beneath the jungle were never waiting silently for one heroic outsider to reveal them. They were known in fragments, remembered in paths, guarded in local landscapes, misunderstood in reports, and slowly reassembled by generations of work. The forest made them difficult to see, but human imagination made them difficult to accept. Once that changes, the green wall opens, and beyond it appears one of the most astonishing hidden worlds on Earth, the vast cities of the Maya lowlands, rising and falling beneath the canopy. The Maya lowlands do not reveal themselves all at once. They appear in pieces, like memories surfacing through green water. A carved stone rises from a clearing, its face softened by time. A stairway climbs into trees and stops beneath a roof of leaves. A temple summit breaks above the canopy just enough to catch the sun, while everything around it remains hidden in shade. From the ground, the old cities seem scattered, almost dreamlike. A pyramid here, a plaza there, a mound that might be natural until its edges prove otherwise. But this broken view is deceptive. beneath the forests of what are now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and surrounding regions. The Maya world was not a thin scattering of ceremonial islands. It was a dense and changing network of kingdoms, roads, fields, reservoirs, courts, shrines, and households, bound together by rivalry, belief, trade, and memory. The great Maya cities were never identical. Each had its own history, dynasties, ambitions, alliances, enemies, and sacred geography. Tikal rose with towering temples and broad plazas deep in the Petén forest. Calakmul spread its power from the south of the Yucatan Peninsula, becoming one of Tikal's most formidable rivals. Palenque, farther west, unfolded with elegant architecture beside hills and streams. Copan, near the southeastern edge of the Maya world, became famous for sculpture so intricate that its stone seems almost woven. Caracol, El Mirador, Yaxchilan, Piedras Negras, Huasactun, and many others formed part of a political landscape that was never still for long. Kings married, fought, captured enemies, celebrated rituals, raised monuments, and tried to anchor their names in stone. The jungle has softened those names, but it has not erased them completely. What is striking is not only the monumentality, but the density of human life around it. For a long time, the tallest temples drew the most attention, because they were visible, impressive, and easier to describe. Yet the Maya city was not only its ceremonial center. Around the plazas stretched residential platforms, courtyards, workshops, terraces, garden plots, reservoirs, causeways, and smaller shrines. Some neighborhoods may have been arranged by kinship, status, craft, or service to elites. Though the evidence remains incomplete, noble families lived closer to power, but common households were not passive shadows beneath royal temples. They farmed, produced goods, maintained local rituals, exchanged food and tools, paid obligations, and participated in the labor that made royal display possible. A king could raise a monument, but only a society could feed the people who cut, carried, plastered, painted, and repaired it. At the heart of many Maya kingdoms stood the royal court, both a political machine and a sacred theatre. The ruler was not merely an administrator, he was a ritual figure, a war leader, a patron, a dynastic descendant, and a living bridge to ancestors and gods. Public ceremonies turned plazas into stages where power could be seen and felt. Steely recorded victories, accessions, sacrifices, alliances, and dates calculated with extraordinary care. The Maya writing system, once misunderstood and long undeciphered by outsiders, now reveals a world of named rulers and political events, though scholars still debate many readings and historical details. These inscriptions do not give a complete history. They are elite statements, selective and often self-serving, but they prove that the cities under the canopy were not mute. They had voices, and those voices were carved for audiences both human and divine. The forest makes it easy to imagine isolation, but the ancient Maya world was deeply connected. Goods moved across landscapes that were difficult but far from impassable. Jade, obsidian, salt, cacao, feathers, ceramics, shells, textiles, and other materials travelled through trade and tribute networks. Rivers served as routes, and so did causeways built across barjos, wetlands, and uneven ground. Obsidian from highland sources could end up far away in lowland cities. Marine shell could reach inland courts. Cacao, valued not only as food but as a prestige product, moved through systems of exchange and obligation. No single map can capture all these flows, because they shifted over centuries with war, alliance, drought, and dynastic fortune. What survives in the record suggests a world where distance did not prevent contact. It made control over routes more valuable. The cities themselves were shaped by both practical and sacred concerns. Maya builders understood stone, lime plaster, drainage, alignment, and visibility. They raised pyramids not simply as piles of masonry, but as mountains made by human hands, often connected to ideas of creation, ancestors, caves, and the layered universe. Plazas gathered people for ceremony and political display. Ball courts marked places where sport, ritual, competition, and cosmic symbolism overlapped. Palaces were not just royal residences, they were administrative spaces, reception areas, storage places, and settings for negotiation. Even the placement of buildings could reflect older sacred orientations, astronomical observations, or inherited local traditions. Some alignments are clear, others are debated. The danger is to make every wall into a cosmic code. The better approach is slower to see that Maya cities were planned within a worldview where politics, landscape, and the sacred were inseparable. A lesser-known detail is how much colour has been lost. Today, many ruins appear grey, pale, or earthy beneath moss and lichen, but ancient Maya buildings were often coated in plaster and painted in vivid colours. Red, blue, yellow, green, black, and white carried meaning, and buildings that now seem like stone skeletons may once have flashed brightly in the sun. Sculpted masks, painted walls, carved lintels, and stucco facades gave the city a visual force that the surviving ruins only hint at. The jungle has stripped away much of that surface world. Rain and roots have reduced painted kingdoms to weathered forms. To walk through a Maya city today is to see the architecture after the forest has taken its colour as payment. Modern mapping has changed the scale of the story dramatically. LIDAR surveys, which use laser pulses from aircraft to measure ground forms beneath vegetation, have revealed vast networks of platforms, roads, terraces, defensive features, and water systems hidden under the canopy. Places once thought to be separated by empty forests sometimes turn out to be linked by built features and settlement zones. This does not mean the entire forest was one continuous city in the modern sense, and responsible scholars are careful about exaggeration. But the results have made one point difficult to deny: the Maya lowlands supported far more complex and extensive human landscapes than earlier ground surveys alone could easily show. The old picture of isolated temple centres has given way to a more crowded, engineered, and politically tangled world. This scale raises harder questions. How did so many people live in landscapes with thin tropical soils, seasonal water stress, and periodic drought? How did rulers persuade communities to keep building monuments while farmers faced the recurring demands of planting, storing, clearing, and repairing? How did rival kingdoms maintain power when alliances could shift and warfare could tear through the same networks that allowed trade to flourish? No single explanation fully accounts for the long success of these cities. Their endurance came from flexibility as much as grandeur: raised fields in some areas, terraces in others, reservoirs where seasonal water had to be captured, household gardens, forest management, and political systems that linked food, labour, ritual, and authority. Yet the same dense connections that made the Maya lowland kingdoms powerful also made them vulnerable. Courts competed for prestige, victories had to be displayed, temples had to be renewed, water systems had to be maintained, farmers had to keep producing, roads and alliances had to remain useful. A city rising above the canopy was not only a monument to strength, it was a demand placed on the landscape and on the people within it. For centuries, that demand was met with astonishing creativity. The jungle-covered ruins show a civilization of mathematicians, builders, artists, scribes, warriors, traders, and farmers who turned forest and limestone into kingdoms of remarkable sophistication. But hidden inside that success was a quiet tension. The same forests that now conceal the ruins once framed the limits of abundance, and the same water that sustained royal power could become the force that exposed its fragility. In the Maya lowlands, water is never simply water. It is power, danger, blessing, and uncertainty gathered into one restless element. For part of the year, rain can fall with such force that the forest seems to dissolve into sound, leaves shining, paths turning to mud, reservoirs filling under a white sky. Then the season turns, the air dries, the same landscape that looked impossibly wet begins to reveal its limits, streams shrink or vanish. Limestone absorbs water into hidden channels and underground cavities. The surface becomes deceptive, green above and thirsty beneath. In such a place, a kingdom cannot survive by waiting for rain alone. It must remember rain, hold it, guide it, store it, and make people believe that the rulers standing above the plazas have some special relationship with the forces that make water return. The Maya were not careless inhabitants of a hostile forest. They were skilled managers of a difficult one. Their cities rose in a landscape where abundance and scarcity could stand very close together. Tropical vegetation gave timber, animals, fruit, fibers, medicines, dyes, and countless useful plants. But farming large populations required planning. Maize, beans, squash, chili, cacao in suitable zones, root crops, tree crops, and household gardens all formed part of a wider food world. The evidence remains incomplete because many plant remains decay quickly, but what survives in soils, pollen, residues, terraces, and ancient field systems suggests a landscape used with far more variety than a simple picture of slash-and-burn farming can explain. People cleared, planted, fallowed, managed forest edges, and modified wetlands. They did not merely live in the jungle, they negotiated with it season after season. Water storage was one of the great negotiations. At cities like Tikal, where permanent surface water was limited, reservoirs became essential. Some were built near the ceremonial core, close to palaces and plazas, where they did more than satisfy thirst. They displayed control. A reservoir in the centre of a city is both infrastructure and symbol. It says that the court can organise labour, shape stone and earth, collect runoff, and guard survival during dry months. The surfaces of plazas and buildings could be plastered and sloped to guide rainwater into storage systems. Channels, dams, aguadas, and modified depressions helped capture what the sky gave briefly and unpredictably. In some places, sediments from reservoirs preserve traces of long use, maintenance, erosion, and changing water quality. These quiet layers of mud can reveal stress more honestly than royal monuments ever would. One surprising detail is that Maya engineers sometimes use materials that may have improved water quality. Research at certain sites has suggested that sand, gravel, and minerals such as zeolite could have served as filtration media in water systems, though scholars still debate the extent and consistency of such practices across the Maya world. Even the possibility is striking. It reminds us that ancient water management was not only a matter of digging holes and waiting for rain. It involved observation, maintenance, experimentation, and inherited practical knowledge. A reservoir that turns foul can become a threat. A reservoir that stays usable through the dry season can keep a neighbourhood alive, sustain a court, and strengthen the belief that the city is properly ordered. But abundance was fragile because it depended on labour. Canals clog, Reservoirs silt up, plaster cracks, embankments erode, terraces fail if neglected. A water system is never finished. It is a promise that must be renewed. Every rainy season brings debris. Every dry season tests storage. Every generation must decide whether to repair what earlier generations built. In a stable kingdom, such maintenance can become routine, woven into obligations of service, tribute, and communal work. In a strained kingdom, the same tasks become heavier. If warfare interrupts farming, if leaders demand too much labour for monuments, if drought reduces harvests, if trust in rulers weakens, infrastructure can decay faster than authority can command it back into order. No single explanation fully accounts for the fate of the Maya cities, but the close bond between water management and political legitimacy is impossible to ignore. The relationship between kings and rain carried sacred weight. Maya rulers performed rituals that linked dynastic power to cosmic order, ancestors, gods, and the cycles of time. Rain was not treated as a purely mechanical problem. It belonged to a world alive with divine forces, caves, mountains, serpents, clouds, lightning, and sacred directions. The human-made pyramid could evoke a mountain. The reservoir could echo primordial water. The court ceremony could dramatize the ruler's role in maintaining balance. To modernize, engineering and ritual may seem separate, but in Maya cities they often reinforced one another. A king who presided over full reservoirs after a hard dry season did not merely succeed as a manager. He appeared aligned with the order of the world. A king who failed during repeated drought faced not only hunger, but a crisis of meaning. Farming stretched this relationship outward into the countryside. Around cities and smaller settlements, people modified land in many ways. In some areas, terraces helped control erosion and made slopes productive. In low-lying wetlands, raised fields and channels could manage waterlogged soils, though their distribution and intensity varied across regions and periods. In household zones, gardens and orchards likely provided food diversity beyond staple crops. Forest management may have encouraged useful trees, creating mosaics of cultivated and semi-wild spaces. What survives in the record suggests a civilization deeply attentive to local environments. The Maya lowlands were not one uniform ecological zone, and strategies that worked near one city might not work near another. This diversity was a strength, but it also means that collapse or transformation did not unfold everywhere in the same way. The pressure of population made the system more delicate. When cities grew, the need for food, fuel, construction materials, and water increased. Lime plaster alone required burning limestone, which demanded large amounts of wood. Monumental building advertised royal power, but it also consumed resources and labour. Agricultural expansion could feed more people. Yet clearing land might increase erosion, reduce forest cover, or make fields more vulnerable in dry years. Scholars still debate the scale of environmental degradation in different Maya regions, and older explanations that blamed collapse on simple overuse of land are now treated with more caution. Still, it is clear that densely populated landscapes leave marks. Lake sediments, pollen changes, and erosion layers suggest that human activity altered watersheds, forests, and soils in ways that could matter when climate became unstable. And climate did become a serious challenge. Evidence from cave formations, lake sediments, and other climate records indicates that parts of the Maya lowlands experienced periods of drought during the centuries when many classic Maya cities were under stress. These were not necessarily uniform disasters everywhere at once, and the exact timing, severity, and social effects remain debated. But drought in a kingdom dependent on stored seasonal rain is not a minor inconvenience. It shortens the margin between confidence and fear, It turns reservoirs into measuring bowls of anxiety. It makes political rivalry sharper, food obligations harder, and ritual promises more dangerous. When rain fails repeatedly, even the tallest temple cannot command clouds by height alone. Yet it would be too simple to imagine thirsty cities collapsing overnight beside empty reservoirs. The Maya story is more human and more complicated. Some communities adapted, some shifted settlement, some centres declined while others persisted. People moved toward more reliable water, reorganised political life, or continued traditions outside the great royal courts. The classic Maya collapse was not the disappearance of the Maya people. It was the unravelling of particular political and urban systems in certain regions, especially the southern lowlands. While Maya communities and cultures endured and transformed, what fell was not a civilization in the absolute sense, but a network of royal capitals whose authority depended on maintaining abundance, meaning, and confidence under growing strain. That is why water sits at the centre of the mystery. It shows the brilliance of Maya adaptation and the limits of that brilliance. Reservoirs, terraces, wetlands, gardens, and sacred landscapes allowed kingdoms to rise where outsiders once assumed large cities could not thrive. But every solution created dependence. The more a city relied on managed water, the more dangerous neglect or drought became. The more rulers tied themselves to rain and cosmic order, the more exposed they were when the sky withheld its answer. Beneath the jungle today, those old reservoirs still rest like dark mirrors. Leaves fall into them. Frogs call from their edges. Roots grip the stones around them. They are quiet now, but they once held the difference between royal splendour and hunger, between faith in the city and the decision to walk away. The unravelling of the classic Maya world does not begin with silence. It begins with too much noise, the noise of courts competing for glory, of armies moving through forest paths, of scribes carving victories into stone, of farmers working harder to meet the needs of cities whose rulers keep building upward. The old reservoirs still catch rain, the plazas still fill for ceremony, and the royal names still appear on monuments with confidence. From a distance, the system can look strong. Temples rise higher. Dynasties announce themselves more fiercely. Kings bind their lives to gods, ancestors, and cycles of time with all the authority that stone can hold. But strength can sometimes become a mask for strain. In the Maya lowlands, the centuries of greatest brilliance also carry the signs of increasing pressure. The collapse people speak of is not a single event, and it is not the end of the Maya. That distinction matters. Maya communities survive beyond the fall of the classic royal capitals, and their descendants live into the present. What changes between roughly the 8th and 10th centuries in many parts of the southern lowlands is the political world of divine kingship, monumental inscriptions, great court-centred cities, and long-standing dynastic rivalries. Some cities decline sharply. Some are abandoned or greatly reduced. Some monuments stop being erected. Palace complexes lose their central role. Population shifts away from regions that had once supported dense settlement. Inscriptions that once proclaimed royal achievement become rarer, then vanish in many places. The jungle does not swallow a civilization overnight. It grows over a political order after that order can no longer hold itself together. Drought is one of the most compelling parts of the story, but it is not the whole story. Climate records from caves, lakes, and sediments suggest that several severe drought episodes affected parts of the Maya lowlands during the period of political crisis. In a landscape where many major cities depend on seasonal rainfall and stored water, drought can intensify every weakness already present. Crops fail or shrink, reservoir levels drop, food storage becomes more important and more contested. Rulers who claim sacred relationships with rain, fertility, and cosmic balance face a dangerous test. If scarcity lasts one season, people may endure. If it returns again and again, patience thins. Ritual authority becomes harder to sustain when the fields remain dry and the reservoirs sink lower each month. Scholars still debate the precise timing and impact of these droughts, but the evidence strongly suggests that climate stress pressed against societies already under strain. Warfare adds another layer, and it is a layer carved directly into the record. Maya inscriptions speak of captures, defeats, accessions, alliances, and the humiliation of rival kings. Defensive features found in some landscapes suggest that conflict could reshape settlement and movement. Warfare among Maya kingdoms was not new, but in periods of instability it may have become more destructive, more frequent, or more damaging to the networks that allowed cities to function. A raid is not only a military event, it can interrupt planting, burn stores, capture elites, displace households, break trade routes, and weaken the aura of a ruling dynasty. A king defeated in battle may lose more than territory. He may lose the belief that his lineage stands under divine favour. In a world where politics and sacred order are braided together, military failure can become a cosmic wound. Political fragmentation deepens the crisis. The Maya lowlands are not ruled by a single empire. They are a shifting mosaic of kingdoms, each with its own court, ambitions, and alliances. This political diversity helps explain the richness of Maya culture, but it also makes coordinated response difficult when conditions worsen. One city may hoard resources rather than share them. Another may try to exploit a rival's weakness. Smaller centres may break away from larger ones. Noble families may compete within courts. Alliances that once stabilized trade and diplomacy may collapse into suspicion. No single explanation fully accounts for the classic Maya collapse, because the Maya world is not one machine breaking in one place. It is a network of many centers, each responding differently to stress, opportunity, fear, and failure. Environmental pressure also accumulates quietly. Dense populations need food, fuel, construction materials, and space. Forest clearing can increase erosion in some areas. Intensive farming can demand careful soil management. Monumental construction requires labour and resources that might otherwise support fields, water systems, or household survival. The production of lime plaster, so important for architecture and water control surfaces, requires burning limestone at high temperatures, which consumes wood. This does not mean the Maya simply destroyed their environment through ignorance. That old idea is too crude. The evidence remains incomplete, and many Maya communities managed forests and fields with skill over long periods. But even well-managed systems have limits when population pressure, elite competition, drought, and conflict converge. A landscape can absorb much until several stresses arrive together and the margin for error disappears. One lesser-known sign of the unravelling is not only abandonment, but interruption. Some construction projects appear unfinished, some monuments are reused, moved, or left in altered contexts. In certain places, elite spaces show signs of disruption, burning, or rapid change. In others, decline seems slower, almost administrative, as if the machinery of court life gradually loses its operators. The end does not look the same everywhere. At one city, the last carved monument may stand like a final statement of royal persistence. At another, households may continue after the court fades. Somewhere else, people may leave in stages, carrying portable objects, memories, seeds, and obligations into new settlements. Archaeology rarely captures the moment of decision, the day a family chooses not to repair a wall, not to plant the same field, not to return after the rains. Yet those quiet decisions may be as important as any battle. Migration turns collapse into transformation. People move toward more reliable water, safer territory, better soils, coastal trade routes, northern centres, or communities where kinship ties offer protection. The northern Maya lowlands, including places in the Yucatan, continued to develop important centres after many southern cities' decline. This uneven pattern is crucial. It shows that the crisis is regional and political, not an absolute cultural disappearance. The Maya language, belief, agriculture, craft traditions, and social life do not vanish with the fall of classic courts. Instead, they are reorganized. The forest may cover abandoned plazas, but human memory travels. Songs, stories, ritual knowledge, farming techniques, and lineages continue beyond the stones that once proclaimed royal immortality. The tragedy is that the kings built for permanence. Their monuments speak in the language of endurance, giving dates that stretch backward into mythic time and forward into imagined continuity. They place their names in stone because stone seems harder than hunger, harder than drought, harder than political betrayal. But stone cannot repair a reservoir. It cannot guarantee rain. It cannot stop farmers from leaving if the cost of obedience becomes too high. The great courts of the southern lowlands depend on a bargain between rulers and communities, labour and loyalty in exchange for order, protection, meaning, access to land, and the promise that the world remains balanced. When drought, war, and fragmentation make that bargain fail, divine kingship loses its practical foundation. What remains beneath the jungle is not evidence of stupidity or simple doom. It is evidence of a civilization that succeeded for centuries in a difficult environment, then faced a convergence of pressures that no single institution could fully absorb. The temples still rise because they were built strongly. The reservoirs still lie in the ground because their basins were cut with care. The roads still leave faint lines because thousands of feet once made movement into habit. But the people who maintain the system no longer gather there in the same way. The court falls quiet first, then the plaster cracks, then the forest begins its slow return. Vines descend over carved faces, trees root in palace rooms, rain fills the old stones with moss. The jungle does not explain the collapse by itself. It only completes it, patiently covering the last visible signs of a world that had already begun to move elsewhere. Far across the ocean from the Maya lowlands, another forest grows over another kind of vanished power. In Cambodia, where heat rises from the earth after rain and tree roots grip stone with the patience of centuries, Angkor appears at first through its temples. Towers shaped like sacred mountains rise above reflective pools. Galleries stretch into shadow. Devata smile from sandstone walls with an expression that seems both present and unreachable. At dawn, Angkor Wat can look less like a ruin than a memory too large to fade. But the temple is only the visible crown of something far greater. Beneath the surrounding jungle, fields, villages, and water channels lies the remains of a vast urban machine, one of the most ambitious engineered landscapes of the pre-industrial world. Angkor was not a single city in the narrow modern sense. It was a shifting capital region of the Khmer Empire, a landscape of royal centres, temples, reservoirs, canals, embankments, roads, rice fields, neighbourhoods, shrines, and administrative spaces spread across an enormous area near the Tonle Sap Lake. Its rulers did not merely build monuments. They organised water, labour, religion, agriculture, and kingship into a system that endured for centuries. From the 9th century onward, Khmer kings raised temple mountains to express their connection to divine order, especially through Hindu and later Buddhist traditions. They placed architecture at the centre of power, but around that architecture stretched a working world of farmers, builders, priests, officials, artisans, servants, and families whose homes were mostly made of perishable materials now largely gone. This is one reason Angkor long seemed more mysterious than it really was. The stone survived. The city around it vanished. Temples built for gods and kings endured because they were made of laterite, brick, and sandstone. Ordinary houses, even elite residences in many cases, were made largely of wood and thatch, materials that the tropical climate consumes quickly. The result is a misleading landscape. A visitor sees magnificent stone sanctuaries standing amid trees and may imagine a ceremonial world separated from daily life. But what survives in the record suggests something more complex. The temples were embedded in a populated, cultivated, and carefully managed environment. The people who maintained Angkor did not live inside the stone towers. They lived around them, worked between them, and moved through networks that the forest later blurred. Water was Angkor's great instrument. The region's climate is shaped by monsoon rhythms, heavy rains in one season, dryness in another, with the Tonle Sap and surrounding floodplains creating extraordinary but uneven abundance. The Khmer rulers and engineers built reservoirs known as barays, along with canals, moats, channels, ponds, embankments, and spillways to guide, store, display, and perhaps redistribute water. The West Baray alone is an astonishing feature. A vast rectangular reservoir stretching for kilometres, so large that it changes the imagination scale of the city. Its size was practical, political, and symbolic all at once. To command such a body of water was to show that kingship could order the landscape itself. Yet scholars still debate exactly how Angkor's hydraulic system functioned in every period. Older interpretations sometimes imagined a perfectly centralised irrigation machine feeding rice fields with imperial precision. Later research has made the picture more nuanced. Some waterworks certainly helped manage supply, drainage, storage, transport, ritual space, and flood control. But the system changed over time and may not have operated as one perfectly coordinated device. The evidence remains incomplete, partly because channels were reused, modified, blocked, and repaired across centuries. What is clear is that Angkor's rulers invested enormous labour in shaping water, and that the success of the capital depended on managing the difficult alternation between too much and too little. The temples themselves were part of this water world. Moats surrounded many major sanctuaries, not simply as decoration, but as cosmic, political, and practical features. In Khmer sacred geography, the temple could represent Mount Meru, the centre of the universe, surrounded by oceans. A moat could therefore turn architecture into a map of cosmic order. But moats also affected drainage, stability, access, and visual power. Angkor Wat's broad moat frames the temple so completely that the building seems to rise from a controlled world of reflection and symmetry. In a landscape where water can destroy as easily as sustain, still water around a temple becomes a statement of mastery. It says that the king's world is ordered, measured, and aligned with forces larger than human life. A lesser-known detail is that much of Angkor's urban fabric was low density and green. It may not have resembled a crowded stone city with narrow streets and continuous walls. Instead, it spread through a mosaic of occupation mounds, ponds, gardens, house plots, roads, canals, and rice fields. This kind of dispersed urbanism can be difficult to recognize if one expects cities to look like Rome, Babylon, or medieval walled capitals. Angkor's form belonged to its environment. It was monumental at the centre, watery across its infrastructure, and often perishable in its domestic spaces. That made it powerful while alive and elusive after abandonment. The jungle did not need to bury every building. Many buildings simply decayed into the soil, leaving only ponds, mounds, and alignments behind. Roads extended Angkor's reach beyond the capital. Raised causeways and routes connected royal centres with provincial temples, rest houses, bridges, and other parts of the Khmer realm. These networks allowed movement of officials, goods, religious authority, military power, and royal messages. Stone bridges still remain in some places, their arches and Naga balustrades hinting at a world of travel through forests, floodplains, and fields. The empire was not held together by temples alone. It required routes, obligations, and the ability to draw resources from wide territories. A capital as large and demanding as Angkor needed rice, labour, stone, timber, metal, craft production, and ritual service. Its grandeur was built on movement as much as on stillness. The rulers of Angkor used architecture to write power into the landscape. Each major king sought legitimacy through building, restoration, conquest, religious patronage, and connection to earlier rulers. Temples were political acts made visible. A new sanctuary could honour a deity, memorialise a royal ancestor, mark a capital, or announce a shift in religious and dynastic emphasis. Angkor Wat, associated with Suryavarman II, was dedicated to Vishnu and built with a scale and refinement that still feels almost impossible. Later, Jayavarman VII reshaped Angkor with Buddhist foundations such as Bayon, Ta Prohm, Preah Khan, hospitals, roads, and rest houses, projecting an image of compassionate kingship and imperial reach. The carved faces of Bayon look outward in all directions, serene and watchful, as if authority itself has become stone. But the hidden machine beneath Angkor was never only royal. It depended on countless unnamed people who cut sandstone blocks, fired brick, cleared channels, planted rice, repaired embankments, carried offerings, carved lintels, cooked food, raised children, and maintained the rhythms that allowed monumental power to appear effortless. The grandeur of Angkor can make labour disappear from the imagination, yet every tower is a record of human backs and hands. Every reservoir edge implies surveyors, diggers, supervisors, and communities whose obligations were tied to the court. No single explanation fully accounts for how such a system was sustained for so long, but it required more than command. It required belief, habit, food surplus, administrative skill, and a landscape capable of supporting the demands placed upon it. Today, roots coil through temple walls and silk cotton trees rise from courtyards where royal foundations once received offerings. Teprom has become famous because the forest seems to be devouring the monument in slow motion, but that image can mislead if taken too simply. The jungle is not just destroying Angkor. It is revealing the tension that was always there between human order and tropical force. Angkor's kings built a world that tried to align earth, water, heaven, and empire. For centuries, it worked with astonishing success, yet every canal that carried water, every reservoir that stored it, every road that crossed wet ground, and every wooden neighbourhood that depended on seasonal balance also made the city vulnerable. Beneath the beauty of the temples lies the deeper mystery of a system so large that, for a long time, no one could see its true shape from the ground. For a long time, Angkor was too large to see because it was too close to the ground. A person could walk from one temple to another, pass a pond dark with leaves, cross a raised path, notice a mound, step around a laterite block half buried in soil, and still fail to understand that these fragments belong to one enormous urban landscape. The forest broke the city into moments. The eye found towers, gates, moats, and carved faces, but the deeper pattern remained scattered beneath trees, rice fields, modern villages, and the slow rearrangements of water. Angkor was not hidden in the sense that Angkor Wat was unknown. Its greatest monuments had never vanished from Cambodian memory. The hidden thing was scale. The mystery was not whether a great city had existed, but how vast, how organized, and how strange that city truly was. Early maps could capture the famous temples, and careful surveys gradually added canals, reservoirs, roads, and smaller sites. But ground survey in a tropical landscape is an act of patience against resistance. Vegetation blocks sight lines. Flooded areas interrupt movement. Modern paths may follow ancient ones, or cut across them in misleading ways. A mound seen from one side may look natural, from another, built. A canal may appear as a ditch until its alignment connects with larger waterworks, and many of Angkor's domestic traces are low to the ground, not monumental enough to announce themselves. The city was not waiting as a clean plan beneath the leaves. It was a palimpsest, written and rewritten over centuries, with royal projects cutting across older systems and later changes blurring earlier ones. Then came the view from above, and eventually the laser that could see through the forest. LIDAR did not discover Angkor, but it changed Angkor's shape in the modern imagination. By sending pulses of light from aircraft and measuring their return, researchers could strip away much of the vegetation digitally and reveal the ground surface beneath. What appeared from this method was not simply a few extra ruins. It was an immense pattern of occupation mounds, ponds, roads, canals, embankments, temple enclosures, field systems, and planned grids spread far beyond the famous stone sanctuaries. The results made visible what walking alone had made difficult to grasp. Angkor was a low-density urban landscape on a scale that challenges familiar definitions of city life. This was one of the surprising revelations. The city did not need to be crowded wall to wall in order to be urban. It could be broad, watery, green, and dispersed. Its population spread among house mounds, gardens, ponds, shrines, and rice fields. Many households appear to have lived within a structured landscape where each occupation mound might be paired with a small pond, creating a repeating pattern of domestic space and water management. Such traces are modest compared with Angkor Wat or Bayon, but they are essential. They show where life happened when no king was being crowned, no temple was being dedicated, no army was returning from campaign. They suggest cooking fires, storage jars, children playing near pond edges, repairs after storms, offerings at local shrines, and work that began before the heat became unbearable. The LiDAR images also revealed that Angkor's order extended outward in ways earlier observers could only partly sense. Linear features crossed the landscape with a precision difficult to explain as natural. Old roads connected sites. Channels guided water through zones that had been reshaped again and again. Around major temples, grids and embankments suggested planned neighborhoods or organized zones of occupation. Some areas showed signs of dense modification, others appeared more open. Perhaps fields, managed wetlands, or lower intensity settlement. The evidence remains incomplete, because a laser map can show shape but not always date, function, or meaning. A mound may be a house platform, a ritual feature, a later modification, or something that changed use over time. Still, when thousands of features appear together, the city stops looking like a group of temples in a forest and begins to look like a whole landscape made political. This transformation matters because it changes the question of Angkor's greatness. Monumental architecture alone can make a civilization seem impressive, but landscape engineering reveals a different kind of ambition. A temple can be built by concentrating resources at one point. A vast urban region requires maintenance across space. Roads must remain passable. Channels must be cleared. Ponds must be managed. Fields must be coordinated with seasonal water. Communities must be connected to centres of authority without being swallowed by them. Angkor's rulers were not only builders of sacred stone, they were organisers of territory, and their capital region was a kind of living diagram of power spread across land and water. The new maps also force scholars to think more carefully about population. How many people lived in Greater Angkor remains debated, and estimates vary depending on what features are counted, how occupation is dated, and how household density is reconstructed. No single number can carry the full truth, but the scale of the mapped landscape suggests a population far larger and more distributed than a temple-centered view would imply. That population needed food, fuel, tools, ceramics, cloth, religious services, and access to water. It also created waste, pressure, and vulnerability. A vast, low-density city may be resilient in some ways, because people are spread across a mosaic of resources, but it may be fragile in others, because its infrastructure is long, exposed, and difficult to repair when the system begins to fail. One lesser-known detail is that LIDAR has revealed not only order but scars. Some channels appear to have been cut, blocked, redirected, or damaged. Water systems show signs of modification that may reflect attempts to solve problems created by earlier solutions. A canal built to move water efficiently can cause erosion if flow becomes too strong. A reservoir designed for storage can silt up. An embankment can protect one area while increasing stress elsewhere, in a monsoon landscape. Engineering is never final. It enters into an argument with rain, sediment, gravity, and time. Angkor's maps show brilliance, but they also show complexity becoming harder to control. The largest lesson from these surveys is humbling. For centuries, people admired Angkor's temples and still underestimated the civilization that made them. The stone towers were so magnificent that they distracted from the quieter achievement beneath them, a managed urban environment almost too broad to fit inside ordinary categories. Angkor was a city of temples, but also a city of ponds, a city of kings, but also a city of rice, a city of cosmic architecture, but also of drainage lines. Household mounds, and practical labour repeated through generations. What survives in the record suggests that its power came not from separating itself from the landscape, but from weaving itself into the landscape so thoroughly that later forest growth could hide the pattern without completely destroying it. And yet, seeing the full pattern does not make the ending simpler. If anything, it makes the later decline more unsettling. A small city can fail from a local disaster. A vast engineered landscape fails differently. It bends, adapts, repairs, strains, and shifts before parts of it finally stop working as intended. The LIDAR maps give Angkor back its size, but size brings weight. Every line on the ground is also an obligation. Every pond is a small promise of maintenance. Every canal is a path water may follow obediently in one century and violently in another. Once Angkor becomes visible as a whole, its beauty remains, but its vulnerability becomes impossible to ignore. The danger in Angkor's greatness is that the same water system that helps make the city powerful can also become the force that exposes its weakness. For centuries, water is directed, stored, slowed, released, framed, and sanctified. It fills moats around temples and ponds beside homes. It moves through canals cut with royal ambition and through small channels shaped by ordinary hands. It reflects towers, feeds rice, cools courtyards, and gives the capital a sense of order in a climate that is never truly obedient. But water does not remain loyal because people have drawn lines for it. A canal is a command only as long as the banks hold. A reservoir is security only as long as it does not silt, crack, overflow, or dry. In a monsoon world, the difference between mastery and disaster can be one season of rain arriving too violently or not arriving at all. Angkor's decline, like the mire unravelling before it, cannot be reduced to one clean cause. It is tempting to imagine a single dramatic fall and invasion, a flood, a drought, a final abandoned temple. The real story is slower, more uneven, and more difficult. Angkor does not simply vanish. Its political centre shifts, its population changes, its waterworks strain, its religious landscape transforms, and its old capital loses the kind of central authority that once made it seem almost immovable. Scholars still debate the timing and weight of each factor, but the evidence points toward a convergence of stresses. Climate instability presses against infrastructure, political power becomes harder to hold, trade and strategic priorities shift, religious life changes shape. The machine still stands, but some of its parts no longer work together as they once did. The climate evidence is especially important because Angkor's system depends so deeply on monsoon rhythms. Tree rings and other climate records suggest that mainland Southeast Asia experienced severe droughts and intense monsoon events during the centuries associated with Angkor's weakening. Drought alone is dangerous. It lowers reservoirs, reduces harvests, stresses households, and forces difficult choices over stored food and labour. But extreme rain after drought can be just as destructive. Dry, cracked, or poorly maintained channels may suddenly receive violent flows. Embankments weakened by neglect can break. Sediment can surge through canals. Water can scour channels deeper, breach banks, or carry debris into places designed for calmer conditions. A system built to manage seasonal variation may fail when variation becomes extreme. This is where Angkor's brilliance becomes complicated. The city's engineers had created an enormous landscape of hydraulic control, but large systems can develop large vulnerabilities. A small village pond can be repaired by a local community. A regional network of canals, embankments, and reservoirs requires coordination across distance. If a major channel fails, the effects can ripple outward. Too much water in one place may mean too little in another. A blocked canal can change the flow of an entire district. A damaged embankment can turn a protective structure into a weapon of erosion. What survives in the record suggests that parts of Angkor's water system were modified repeatedly, perhaps in response to problems that earlier modifications had helped create. No single explanation fully accounts for this, but the pattern fits a system under stress repair, adjustment, redirection, failure, and repair again, until maintenance itself becomes a struggle. Political strain would have made that struggle harder. Angkor's waterworks were not maintained by stone or by kingship as an idea. They were maintained by people. Labour had to be organised. Authority had to be accepted or enforced. Communities had to clear channels, rebuild banks, manage local ponds, and continue producing rice even when conditions worsened. If royal power weakened, the practical routines of maintenance could weaken with it. A king might still claim sacred legitimacy, but if he could not mobilise enough labour or guarantee enough security, the city's vast infrastructure would begin to lose coherence. In a low-density urban landscape, this kind of weakening may not look like instant collapse. It may look like neglected channels, abandoned mounds, shrinking occupation, local adaptation, and the gradual loss of connection between once linked districts. There are also signs that Angkor's political world was changing under pressure from outside forces and shifting regional patterns. The rise of powerful Thai polities, including Ayutthaya, altered the balance of power in mainland Southeast Asia. Military conflict played a role in Angkor's later history, though older stories sometimes made invasion seem like the whole explanation. It was not. An attack can damage a capital, but it is most devastating when the capital is already strained. The movement of political focus toward areas closer to riverine and maritime trade may also have mattered. As trade networks changed, a capital deeply tied to inland water management and monumental kingship may have become less suited to new economic realities. The evidence remains incomplete, but the shift toward the Phnom Penh region in later centuries suggests that geography, trade, and political strategy were being recalculated. Religious change adds another layer, quieter but profound. Angkor's royal temples were tied for centuries to Hindu traditions and later forms of Mahayana Buddhism, often centered on the king's role as a sacred builder and cosmic figure. Over time, Theravada Buddhism became increasingly important in Cambodia. This did not cause Angkor's decline in any simple way, and it should not be treated as a sudden replacement that broke the state, but it may have altered the relationship between kingship, temple building, merit, and religious authority. Massive state temples, requiring extraordinary labor and royal display, may have lost some of their earlier ideological force. Religious life could continue, even flourish, while the old style of royal monumentality became less central. A civilization can change its spiritual center without disappearing, but such a change can weaken the symbolic foundations of an older political order. The temples themselves show both continuity and transformation. Angkor Wat, unlike many ruins that fall into total abandonment, remains a sacred place across centuries. Monks, pilgrims, local communities, and later rulers continue to give it meaning. This matters because it prevents the easy phrase "lost city" from becoming too simple. Angkor was never completely lost to the people of Cambodia. Its stones remained in memory, worship, and landscape. What declined was the old imperial capital as a functioning centre of vast political and hydraulic power. The jungle grew over many places, but devotion persisted in others. Collapse, here again, is not annihilation. It is reorganization, displacement, and the fading of one form of authority while other forms survive. One lesser-known aspect of Angkor's decline is the possibility that parts of the city became victims of their own accumulated complexity. As canals and reservoirs were added over centuries, the landscape became layered with old and new interventions. Later engineers inherited earlier choices. They did not begin with blank ground. A channel cut by one king might constrain the plans of another. A reservoir built for one pattern of settlement might become awkward as population shifted. Sediment carried from upstream could slowly reduce capacity. Repairs could solve immediate problems while creating future ones. This is a familiar pattern in large human systems. Success builds infrastructure. Infrastructure builds dependence. And dependence makes retreat difficult when conditions change. By the time Angkor's old centre loses its dominance, the forest does not need to conquer a thriving empire. It enters a landscape already transformed by political movement, religious change, water stress, and shifting human priorities. The canals continue to hold traces of their former purpose, but some no longer guide water as intended. Ponds fill with leaves, house mounds sink into vegetation, roads remain as raised lines beneath grass and roots, temples endure, but many stand without the dense web of labour that once gave them daily life. The city too large to see becomes, slowly, a city too large to maintain. And still, Angkor's ending should not be read only as failure. It is also a lesson in scale. For centuries, Khmer rulers and communities made a monsoon landscape serve one of the most extraordinary urban experiments in human history. They built with stone, water, earth, belief, and labour. They created a capital that could turn seasonal rain into political power and sacred theatre. But water is never permanently conquered. It remembers gravity. It carries silt. It waits for weakness at Angkor. The element that once reflected temples like perfect mirrors eventually helped reveal the limits of the world built around them. From Angkor's canals and temple moats, the trail of hidden kingdoms turns toward a forest so vast that for a long time it seemed to swallow not only ruins, but the very possibility of ruins. The Amazon does not offer towers like Tikal or Angkor Wat rising above the trees. It does not greet the traveller with sandstone faces, royal stairways, or carved monuments announcing dynasties in the language of kings. Its scale is different, and so is its silence. Rivers wider than seas in the rainy season twist through a green world of floodplain, high forest, palm swamp, savanna edge, and dark water. The canopy stretches so far that the human mind easily mistakes it for timeless wilderness. Yet beneath that living surface are earthworks, causeways, raised fields, fish weirs, mounds, ditches, altered soils, and forests shaped by human hands so patiently that they can look entirely natural until the pattern is seen. For much of modern history, outsiders imagine the Amazon as a place hostile to large and complex societies. The soil was said to be too poor, the forest too dense, the climate too punishing, the environment too resistant to anything beyond small, scattered groups living lightly along rivers. This idea became powerful partly because the Amazon seen by later explorers was already a landscape after catastrophe, though that catastrophe belongs more fully to a later part of the story. By the time many Europeans described the region in detail, population had been transformed by disease, violence, slavery, missionization, and displacement. The silence they encountered was not necessarily ancient silence. It may have been the silence after a human storm. What survives in the record now suggests a more complicated Amazon. Not a single empire hidden under trees, not a stone kingdom waiting to be uncovered, and not the fantasy of a lost golden city. Instead, archaeologists are finding evidence for many different societies that built in ways suited to their worlds. Some created geometric earthworks in what is now western Brazil, with ditches and embankments forming circles, squares, and long avenues visible from above. Some raised mounds on Marajo Island near the mouth of the Amazon, lifting settlements and ceremonial spaces above seasonal flooding. Some shaped the Bolivian Llanos de Mojos with raised fields, canals, causeways, and fish management systems across a vast wetland plain. Some communities in the Upper Xingu built networks of villages linked by roads, plazas, ditches, and managed landscapes, forming what scholars have described as garden cities. The evidence remains incomplete, but the old image of an untouched forest with only tiny human footprints no longer holds. The most important difference is material. In Mesoamerican Cambodia, stone helps memory survive. In Amazonia, many societies built with earth, wood, thatch, palm, clay, and living plants. These materials can be perfectly suited to local needs and almost invisible after centuries. A wooden house may be spacious, elegant, and socially important while people maintain it, yet leave little behind after rot, termites, fire, and regrowth. A plaza cleared in the forest may return to vegetation. A palisade may vanish except for stains in soil. A sacred or political centre may survive not as a temple, but as a mound, ditch, road, or unusually rich patch of earth. To mistake the absence of stone for the absence of complexity is to misunderstand the language of the landscape. One of the most surprising clues is terra preta, the dark earth found in many parts of the Amazon. These soils are rich, deep, and often filled with charcoal, pottery fragments, bone, organic waste, and other traces of long occupation, in a region where many natural soils are heavily weathered and nutrient-poor. Terra preta stands out like a human signature. It was formed through repeated burning, disposal, composting, cooking, and settlement activity over generations. And in some cases it remains fertile centuries later. It is not a palace wall or a royal tomb, but it is perhaps more intimate. It marks where people lived, cooked, planted, discarded, improved, and returned. It shows that some Amazonian communities did not merely adapt to difficult soils, they transformed them. The forest itself also carries traces of human preference. Certain useful trees, including palms and fruit-bearing species, are unusually abundant near archaeological sites in some regions. This does not mean every useful tree proves ancient cultivation, and scholars still debate the extent and intensity of forest domestication across the basin. But the pattern is too important to ignore. People moved seeds, protected favoured species, cleared competing growth, burned carefully, planted gardens, and encouraged groves that served food, medicine, construction, ritual, and trade. Over time, these choices could reshape forest composition. What appears as wilderness may in places be partly descended from orchards, managed fallows, and old settlement zones. The jungle does not simply cover human history. In parts of Amazonia, it grows from human history. Water again becomes central, though in a different form from Angkor or the Maya lowlands. In Amazonia, the problem is often not a lack of water, but its overwhelming seasonality and movement. Floodplains rise and fall, savanna wetlands drown and dry, rivers shift banks, erase settlements, create new islands, and carry fish, silt, timber, and people across enormous distances. Ancient communities responded with raised fields that lifted crops above floodwater, canals that moved water through agricultural landscapes, causeways that allowed travel across wet ground, and fish traps that turned seasonal flooding into stored food. In the Llanos de Mojos, the scale of earthwork landscapes suggests generations of careful environmental knowledge. These were not crude attempts to dominate nature. They were ways of working with flood pulses, soil, fish, plants, and movement. The great rivers formed highways. Canoes could connect communities across distances that would be almost impossible by land. Along waterways, people exchanged ceramics, food, ornaments, ideas, spouses, stories, ritual knowledge, and political influence. Some early European accounts, though difficult to interpret and sometimes unreliable, describe large settlements along the Amazon River. Archaeology has not confirmed every dramatic claim, and responsible scholars remain cautious. But the growing evidence of dense occupation in certain regions makes those accounts harder to dismiss entirely. No single explanation fully accounts for the diversity of Amazonian societies, because the basin is not one environment. Upland forests, floodplains, savannas, blackwater rivers, whitewater rivers, and coastal islands all offer different possibilities and constraints. This is why Amazonia before the silence must be imagined as a mosaic rather than a hidden empire. Its forgotten kingdoms were often chiefdoms, regional societies, village networks, ceremonial landscapes, and managed territories rather than centralized stone states. Their power may have rested in control of river routes, seasonal fisheries, fertile dark earth, ritual places, alliance networks, and the ability to organize labor across flood and forest. Their monuments were not always vertical. Some lay flat across the ground, visible only as geometry, a circle cut into earth, a road between villages, a mound above floodwater, a field raised by baskets of soil, a forest rich with trees people once favoured. The silence of the Amazon is therefore misleading. It is not the silence of emptiness, but of materials that decay, populations that were disrupted, landscapes that heal quickly, and histories that were often recorded by outsiders only after the worst had already begun. Beneath the canopy, the evidence does not point to one lost city of gold. It points to something stranger and more important, a forest where human societies shaped land, water, soil, and vegetation for centuries, then left traces so subtle that only patient eyes could learn to see them. The Amazon was not outside history. It was one of history's great green archives, written in earth instead of stone. The phrase garden city can sound gentle, almost decorative, as if it describes a pleasant settlement softened by trees and paths. In Amazonia, it means something deeper and stranger. It describes a form of human order that does not always announce itself with walls, towers, or stone avenues, but with villages arranged around plazas, roads cut through forest, ditches marking community boundaries, orchards blending into woodland, and fields, ponds, and useful plants woven into daily life. These were not cities in the familiar sense of crowded streets packed behind defensive walls. They were open, green, dispersed, and alive with managed growth. To people expecting civilization to look like stone, they could seem invisible. To the people who lived there, they were landscapes of memory, food, ritual, kinship, and power. In the Upper Xingu region of Brazil, archaeological work has revealed settlement networks that challenge older assumptions about Amazonian simplicity. Villages were often arranged with remarkable planning, circular or oval plazas surrounding houses, roads leading outward with deliberate alignment, and ditches or earthworks framing the community. Some settlements were linked to others in clusters, forming regional systems rather than isolated hamlets. The roads were not random trails. They could be broad, straight, and placed with intention, connecting communities across a forested landscape that outsiders once imagined as nearly trackless. What survives in the record suggests a world where social order was mapped directly onto the ground, not in stone blocks, but in cleared spaces, paths, earth, and repeated settlement forms. These garden cities depended on a different idea of monumentality. A stone pyramid forces itself on the eye even after abandonment. A plaza in the forest does not. Yet for the people who built and used it, an open central space could be as politically and ritually important as a temple court. It gathered bodies, ceremonies, decisions, dances, feasts, and public memory. Houses arranged around it turned social life inward toward a shared centre. Roads extending from it connected that centre to gardens, neighbouring settlements, rivers, and ritual places. Ditches may have marked boundaries, defended communities, drained water, or carried symbolic meaning, depending on the site and period. The evidence remains incomplete, but the pattern is clear enough to show planning, cooperation, and a strong sense of place. Wood made these worlds both adaptable and fragile in the archaeological record. A great house built of timber and palm could be impressive, carefully made and full of meaning, yet after abandonment it might leave only post holes, soil stains, pottery fragments, and subtle changes in the ground. This has made Amazonian complexity easy to underestimate. The absence of stone was treated for too long as absence itself. But stone is not the only measure of civilization. In a wet tropical world, wood may be the logical material, renewable, abundant, flexible, cool, and easy to repair. A society that builds with living and perishable materials is not necessarily less organized than one that cuts blocks from a quarry. It has simply chosen a different relationship with time. The managed forest around these communities was part of the architecture. Fruit trees, palms, medicinal plants, useful hardwoods, fibers, resins, dyes, and food plants could form a living infrastructure. Gardens may have blended into orchards, orchards into managed forest into hunting grounds, and hunting grounds into neighbouring territories. This blurring can confuse modern categories. A field is not always sharply separate from a forest. A village edge is not always a hard border. Human activity can create mosaics where cultivation, gathering, hunting, and ritual overlap. Scholars still debate how intensive these systems were in different regions. But the old division between wild nature and cultivated land is too blunt for much of Amazonian history. One surprising detail is that some Amazonian societies may have increased biodiversity in the places they used most, by encouraging many useful species together, creating forest gardens, and enriching soils. People could make landscapes more productive without turning them into open, uniform fields. This is not the same as untouched wilderness, and it is not the same as industrial agriculture. It is a third pattern, one in which human management can be subtle, cumulative, and ecologically complex. A traveller passing through generations later might see only forest, not realizing that the abundance of certain palms, fruit trees, or fertile soils may reflect centuries of human preference. The city, in this sense, does not disappear beneath the forest. It becomes forest. Power in such landscapes may have worked differently from the power of divine kings at Tikal or Angkor. Many Amazonian societies seem to have been organized through chiefs, regional leaders, ritual specialists, councils, kin groups, and alliance networks rather than through stone palace monarchies. Authority could be persuasive, ceremonial, redistributive, or martial, and it likely varied greatly from place to place. Control over labour mattered, but so did control over relationships. Marriage ties, exchange routes, ritual knowledge, seasonal gatherings, and access to productive land and water. No single explanation fully accounts for Amazonian political diversity, because the region was never one cultural world. It was a vast collection of peoples, languages, environments, and histories, linked by rivers and separated by forests at the same time. The lack of written records means that many details remain beyond reach. There are no long royal inscriptions naming rulers, victories, and sacred dates in the way Maya monuments do. Instead, Amazonian history must be reconstructed from earthworks, ceramics, soils, settlement layouts, plant distributions, oral histories, early colonial accounts, and the knowledge of indigenous communities whose traditions are not relics, but live in forms of historical memory. This requires a different patience. The past does not speak in carved names. It speaks through patterns, the repetition of village plans, the spread of ceramic styles, the placement of mounds above floodwater, the depth of dark earth, the geometry visible from the air, the survival of useful forests where people once lived. There is also a danger in replacing one era with another. For a long time, outsiders underestimated Amazonian societies. Now the temptation is sometimes to overcorrect, to imagine vast hidden empires everywhere beneath the canopy, or to revive old fantasies of lost golden cities. That would be another distortion. The real evidence is more subtle and more interesting. Amazonia held many kinds of complexity, not all of them urban in the same way. not all of them centralized, and not all of them large. Some regions supported dense settlement and engineered landscapes. Others may have supported mobile, flexible, or smaller communities whose histories are no less important. The power of the new archaeology is not that it turns the Amazon into a copy of the Maya world or Angkor. It shows that complexity can take forms that older theories failed to recognize. The garden cities beneath the forest remind us that civilization is not a single architectural style. It can be stone towers above plazas, or reservoirs framed by temples, or networks of villages connected by roads through living green. It can be written in glyphs, carved in sandstone, pressed into earth, or grown in orchards that outlive the hands that planted them. Amazonian societies built worlds where the boundary between settlement and environment was deliberately porous. Their cities breathed. They shaded themselves. They fed people through diversity rather than only through rigid fields. They left behind fewer monuments for conquerors to admire, but perhaps deeper traces in soil and forest. When such a world collapses or changes, it does not leave a skyline of ruins. It leaves a silence that looks natural. The houses rot, the plazas fill with growth, the roads narrow into animal paths, the ditches soften, the orchards become forest. The dark earth remains underfoot, rich with broken pottery and charcoal. From above, geometry still appears when the light is right or when lasers strip away the leaves. From below, the old city may feel like nothing more than shade. But shade can be historical. A fruiting palm beside an ancient mound, a road line beneath roots, a circular village plan preserved as a faint earthwork. These are the monuments of a civilization that built with life as much as with earth. The forest that later travellers called empty was not empty in the way they imagined. It was wounded. That difference changes the whole story. When Europeans entered Amazonia and other tropical worlds after 1492, they often believed they were seeing landscapes close to their original state, vast forests, scattered people, rivers without great cities, wilderness waiting to be mapped, claimed, missionized, exploited, or explained. But many of those landscapes had already passed through disaster. Disease moved faster than armies, violence moved along rivers, slaving raids shattered communities, missions gathered survivors and broke older settlement patterns. Trade goods altered alliances, flight became a survival strategy. Whole regions that had once held dense networks of villages, gardens, roads, fish traps, and ceremonial places became quieter, not because they had never supported large populations, but because the people who maintained them were dying, moving, or being forced into new worlds. This collapse without empty land is one of the hardest histories to see archaeologically, because the forest can make catastrophe look peaceful after enough time. A battlefield may become green. A burned village may become a stand of palms. A road no longer cleared becomes a corridor for animals and vines. Raised fields still shape the wetland, but the hands that kept their channels open are gone. A settlement mound remains above floodwater, but houses no longer rise on it. Terra preta soils continue to be fertile, yet the community that formed them may have been scattered. What survives in the record suggests not a simple disappearance, but a violent thinning of human presence followed by ecological recovery. The jungle grows beautifully over events that were anything but gentle. Disease was the first great destroyer, and in many places it arrived before Europeans themselves were physically present. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other infections move through indigenous trade routes, river networks, warfare, and refugee movements. Populations with no previous exposure to these pathogens suffered devastating losses. Exact numbers remain debated, because the evidence remains incomplete, and early accounts are uneven, exaggerated in some places and silent in others. But the broad pattern is beyond doubt. Epidemics caused mortality on a scale that transformed the Americas in Amazonia, where many communities were connected by rivers and exchange. Disease could spread across great distances, leaving later observers to encounter societies already reduced from what they had been. The effects of epidemic collapse were not only numerical. Losing half a community, or more, is not simply a matter of fewer people. It breaks memory. It removes elders who know ritual sequences, planting cycles, diplomatic histories, medicinal practices, boundaries, songs, and the story attached to places. It leaves children without parents, leaders without followers, fields without workers, and alliances without the people who held them together. It can make ordinary maintenance impossible. Canals clog because no one has enough labour to clear them. Orchards go unmanaged. Fish traps fail. Roads grow over. Ceremonies that once gathered regional communities become harder to perform. Political authority weakens, not because people forget how to organise, but because the human web that organisation depends on has been torn. Conquest and colonial violence deepened that tearing. In many parts of Amazonia, Europeans and their colonial descendants sought labour, souls, territory, forest products, and control over river routes. Enslavement and raiding displaced communities again and again. Some groups fled deeper into forests or moved away from major rivers to avoid capture. Others gathered around missions, sometimes voluntarily for protection, often under coercion. Where disease could spread more easily, and older patterns of life were suppressed or reorganized. New weapons, metal tools, cloth, beads, and trade goods entered indigenous politics, sometimes strengthening certain leaders while destabilizing older balances. No single explanation fully accounts for the collapse of Amazonian societies after contact, because disease, violence, missionization, trade, and indigenous strategies of survival all interacted in different ways across different regions. One lesser-known consequence is that ecological regrowth may have changed global perceptions of the tropics. When large populations decline, cultivated fields, gardens, orchards, and managed forests can revert toward denser growth. In some regions of the Americas, reforestation after indigenous population collapse may even have affected carbon storage, though scholars still debate the scale and climate significance of this process. What matters here is the historical illusion it created. Later colonists, naturalists, and explorers often walked through forests that seemed ancient and untouched, when in fact some of those forests may have expanded over abandoned farms, settlements, and managed landscapes only a few generations old. The apparent wilderness was partly a memorial, but one written in leaves. This does not mean that every forest was once a city, or that every quiet riverbank hides a lost town. Responsible history must avoid turning the entire Amazon into a single vanished metropolis. Many communities were smaller, mobile, seasonal, or lightly visible archaeologically even before contact. Some places were always less densely inhabited than others, but the older opposite view, that Amazonia was largely incapable of sustaining complex societies, has become impossible to defend in its simplest form. The truth is uneven. Some regions supported dense settlement and landscape engineering. Others held flexible networks of communities moving with seasonal resources. Some societies built earthworks, others built mostly with plants and wood. What European contact did was not erase one uniform civilization, but disrupt a vast mosaic of human worlds. The human response to disaster was also uneven. People did not simply vanish into passivity. They fled, hid, resisted, negotiated, adopted new tools, formed new alliances, absorbed refugees, abandoned dangerous places, and sometimes deliberately made themselves harder to find. In a forested world, invisibility can be protection. Moving away from major rivers might reduce access to trade but increase safety. Smaller settlements might be less impressive to archaeologists but more survivable under threat. Cultural transformation could be a strategy rather than a sign of failure. Some communities preserved identity through movement, others merged with neighbours, others reconstituted social life after repeated losses. The phrase "forgotten kingdoms" can make disappearance sound final, but survival often continued in forms that leave fewer monumental traces. This is why the idea of empty land became so politically dangerous. If a forest was imagined as unused wilderness, outsiders could claim it more easily. If people were seen as scattered remnants without deep history, their rights to land could be dismissed. If ruins were treated as mysteries disconnected from living indigenous peoples, the past could be admired while the present was dispossessed. The same pattern appeared in different forms across the world: monuments praised, descendants ignored, ancient engineering admired, living land knowledge dismissed. In Amazonia, this mistake had especially lasting consequences because the most important traces of old societies were often ecological and subtle. A managed forest does not always look like a monument to the eyes of someone trained to value stone. Archaeology now pushes back against that emptiness. Earthworks reveal planning. Dark earth reveals long occupation. Plant distributions reveal management. Oral histories preserve movements, conflicts, origins, and sacred landscapes, colonial documents, when read cautiously. Hint at larger populations and settlements before collapse. None of these sources is complete on its own. Each has limits, distortions, and silences. But together, they show that many forests were not outside history. They were places where history had been interrupted so violently that regrowth became part of the disguise. The living forest after catastrophe is therefore both beautiful and troubling. Birds nest where roofs once stood. Vines cross old roads. Fruit trees planted by forgotten hands feed animals and people who may never know the names of the planters. A mound becomes a hill, a ditch becomes a shadow, a village plan becomes a pattern visible only from the air. The land is not empty. It is layered with absence. Beneath the green surface lies the memory of communities that did not fail because they lacked intelligence, skill, or complexity. Many were broken by forces arriving from far beyond their forests, forces they could not have anticipated and could not easily resist. The jungle grew back, and to later eyes it looked eternal. But eternity, in this case, was an illusion made by leaves. To find a kingdom beneath the jungle, the first tool is still patience. A person must walk slowly through heat, thorns, mud, insects, and green confusion, learning to notice what the forest tries to make ordinary: a rise in the ground, a scatter of pottery, a depression that holds water too neatly, a line of stones under roots, a palm grove growing where it should not be so dense. These remain the beginning of discovery. But the modern search for hidden worlds has changed because archaeology no longer depends only on what the eye can see from the forest floor. It can now look from above, below, inside soil, inside lake mud, even inside fragments of bone and plant matter. The jungle still hides, but the tools used to read it have become sharper. Lidar is the most dramatic of these tools because it turns invisibility into shape. From an aircraft, laser pulses are fired toward the ground millions of times. Most strike leaves, branches, and upper vegetation, but some pass through gaps in the canopy and return from the surface below. When enough of these returns are gathered, computers can filter away much of the forest and build a model of the terrain underneath. Suddenly, what was a wall of green becomes a landscape of mounds, roads, terraces, canals, reservoirs, ditches, platforms, and long-forgotten alignments. The effect can seem almost magical, but it is not magic. It is measurement repeated at overwhelming scale. The forest is not removed in reality. It is removed mathematically. In the Maya lowlands, LIDAR has revealed settlement density and landscape modification on a scale that earlier researchers could only partly imagine. It has shown causeways linking centres, defensive features, agricultural terraces, reservoirs, and countless structures hidden beneath canopy. It has helped change the old image of isolated ceremonial centres into a picture of densely used and politically complex landscapes. At Angkor, LIDAR made visible the low-density city around the famous temple's house mounds, ponds, canals, grids, roads, and waterworks spreading across the landscape. In Amazonia, airborne and satellite-based surveys have helped identify geometric earthworks, settlement patterns, and raised field systems in places where stone monuments were never the main form of architecture. One surprising result is that many of the most important discoveries are not large temples, but ordinary shapes repeated again and again, showing where daily life once filled the forest. Yet LIDAR does not answer every question. It reveals form, not meaning by itself. A rectangular mound may be a house platform, a shrine base, a later modification, or a natural feature altered by human use. A ditch may be defensive, symbolic, hydraulic, or some combination of these. A road may have been used for trade, ritual movement, political connection, or ordinary travel. The evidence remains incomplete until researchers return to the ground. LIDAR gives archaeology a map of possibilities. Excavation, dating, artifacts, and local knowledge must turn those possibilities into history. Without fieldwork, a beautiful image from the air can become another kind of illusion. Satellite imagery adds another layer, especially across large regions where aircraft surveys are expensive or difficult. Satellites can reveal differences in vegetation, moisture, elevation, and soil that hint at buried structures or altered landscapes. In drier seasons, old canals or walls may show as lines of greener or browner growth. In wetlands, raised fields and causeways can appear as subtle patterns. Thermal and multispectral imaging can detect variations not obvious to human eyes. These tools are especially useful for seeing broad relationships, how a settlement connects to rivers, how fields spread across a floodplain, how roads align with temples or villages, how modern land use threatens ancient remains. But satellite images, like LIDAR, must be interpreted cautiously. Natural processes can imitate human geometry, and human features can be blurred by centuries of erosion, farming, flooding, and regrowth. The ground itself gives quieter evidence. Soil chemistry can reveal where people lived, cooked, kept animals, made tools, discarded waste, or performed repeated activities. Phosphates, charcoal, organic residues, microscopic plant remains, and pottery fragments can mark ancient households even when no walls survive. In Amazonia, dark earth shows long-term human enrichment. In Maya and Angkorian landscapes, soil studies can help distinguish domestic zones, craft areas, fields, erosion deposits, and water management features. A temple may tell us what rulers wanted remembered, but soil tells us where meals happened and where work continued day after day. It is less dramatic, but often more honest. Lake sediments and wetland deposits carry another kind of memory. Year after year, particles settle at the bottom, forming layers that can preserve pollen, charcoal, minerals, and traces of erosion. Pollen shows changes in vegetation forest giving way to maize fields, rice cultivation, grasses, palms, or later regrowth. Charcoal suggests burning, whether from farming, cooking, natural fire, warfare, or land clearance. Sediment washed from hillsides can show erosion after forest clearing or agricultural expansion. In the Maya lowlands, climate records from caves and lakes help reconstruct droughts and rainfall changes. Near Angkor, environmental records help place human water management within wider monsoon variability. Scholars still debate details of timing and causation, but these natural archives allow the history of cities to be placed inside the history of climate. Even the smallest remains can change the map. Microscopic starch grains and phytoliths can identify plants used for food or construction. Residues inside pottery can reveal what vessels once held. Charred seeds can show crops, wild foods, and fuel use. Animal bones, shells, and a fish remains can reconstruct diets and trade. Ancient DNA, where preservation allows it, can help trace population history, domesticated plants, animals, pathogens, and relationships between groups. Though tropical heat and humidity often make DNA survival difficult, no single technique can rebuild a vanished kingdom alone, but together, these methods create a web of evidence strong enough to challenge old assumptions. There is also a growing recognition that local and indigenous knowledge is not an optional decoration to scientific work. It can guide researchers toward places that maps miss, explain landscape features, preserve names, identify useful plants, and keep alive memories of movement, sacred geography, and ancestral presence. In many regions, collaboration is not only ethically necessary, it improves the archaeology. The people living near ruins are not obstacles to the past. They are part of its continuity. What survives in the record is richer when the archive includes both instruments and memory. The tools that see through leaves have not made the jungle transparent. They have made it more complicated. Each new map reveals not just lost places, but lost questions. How many people lived there? How long did they stay? Were these features used at the same time or across centuries? Which changes were caused by climate? Which by politics? Which by ritual? Which by daily necessity? Modern technology can expose the outline of a hidden world, but it cannot remove uncertainty. It can only give uncertainty better edges. Still, the transformation is immense. Forests once dismissed as empty now appear as layered human landscapes. Mounds become neighborhoods. Ditches become boundaries. Ponds become household systems. Dark soils become generations of cooking fires. Ancient canals become evidence of ambition and vulnerability. The green surface remains, alive and restless. But beneath it, the old kingdoms are no longer shapeless. They are returning as patterns, and pattern is the beginning of memory. Once the forest begins to give back its hidden patterns, imagination rushes in faster than evidence. A line of earthworks becomes, in careless retelling, the border of a lost empire. A mound becomes a buried palace. A rumour of gold becomes a vanished city. The jungle has always invited this kind of dreaming because it hides so much and reveals so little at a glance. Where sight fails, stories multiply. Travellers hear of stone ruins beyond a river, lights in the forest, old roads no one uses, treasure sealed beneath roots, temples guarded by spirits, cities swallowed for their pride, kings who vanished underground, or strangers who built monuments before the ancestors of living people arrived. Some stories preserve fragments of memory, others grow from conquest, greed, misunderstanding, or the simple human desire to make ruins more dramatic than they already are. The legend of the lost city is one of the most persistent myths in the history of tropical exploration. In the Amazon, it often takes the form of a golden kingdom, a place of impossible wealth hidden beyond the reach of maps. In Central America, it becomes a forgotten Maya metropolis waiting beneath vines, filled with sealed chambers and royal secrets. In Southeast Asia, it appears as jungle temples abandoned in a single mysterious catastrophe, as if an entire population stood up one day and vanished into the trees. These versions are powerful because they are simple. They give the audience a treasure, a secret, a disappearance, and a promise that one more expedition will finally solve everything. The real past is richer, but less obedient. It does not usually arrange itself into a single glittering revelation. Treasure stories are especially misleading because they pull attention away from what matters most. Gold, jade, carved stone, royal tombs, and sacred objects can be historically important, but they are not the whole civilization. A reservoir may reveal more about survival than a jeweled ornament. A field system may tell a deeper story than a palace wall. A dark layer of soil may preserve more human truth than a spectacular artifact placed in a museum case. Looters have often understood the monetary value of ancient objects while destroying the context that gives those objects meaning. A pot ripped from the ground can be sold. The location of that pot, its relation to a house floor, burial, offering, workshop, or midden, is lost forever. In archaeology, context is not a detail. It is the difference between an object and a history. Popular myths also tend to separate ruins from descendants. This is one of their quiet violences. The more a city is described as impossibly mysterious, the easier it becomes to imply that local people could not have built it, understood it, or preserved its memory. In the past, some writers invented lost races, foreign builders, wandering survivors of distant civilizations, or other unsupported explanations to account for monuments that indigenous or local ancestors had every capacity to create. Such theories are not only wrong, they repeat old prejudices. The evidence remains incomplete in many places, but it does not require imaginary outsiders. The Maya built Maya cities. Khmer labor, knowledge, and kingship built Angkor. Amazonian peoples shaped Amazonian forests. The real achievement belongs to the societies rooted in those landscapes. This does not mean local legends should be dismissed. Quite the opposite. Oral traditions, place names, sacred stories, and community memories can contain valuable historical clues. A story about an old settlement, a forbidden mound, a sacred pond, a road of ancestors, or a hill where offerings were made may lead researchers toward evidence that maps missed. But such traditions must be approached with respect and care, not mined for sensational claims. They do not function like modern excavation reports, and they're not obliged to answer outside questions in outside categories. What survives in the record suggests that memory can persist in layered forms: ritual, avoidance, naming, seasonal movement, planting, pilgrimage, and storytelling. The mistake is not listening to tradition. The mistake is forcing it to become a treasure map. Another myth is the idea of sudden disappearance. It is easy to say a jungle city was abandoned overnight because the image is haunting: empty plazas, silent temples, fires gone cold, the forest waiting at the edge. But most collapses are slower and messier. The Maya royal courts decline unevenly across regions and generations. Angkor's political center shifts while sacred use continues. Amazonian landscapes are transformed by disease, violence, movement, survival, and regrowth, rather than one clean vanishing. No single explanation fully accounts for these changes, and that uncertainty can feel less satisfying than a dramatic ending. Yet the truth is more human. People leave in stages. They return, or do not. They carry children, tools, seeds, grief, stories, and obligations. They settle elsewhere. They adapt. The city falls silent not because humanity disappears, but because life has moved beyond the place where stone, earth, and water once held it. There is also the myth of the untouched jungle, the belief that deep forest is always nature without history. This myth can appear gentle, even romantic, but it erases human labour from the land. In the Amazon, it makes managed forest look accidental. Around Angkor, it makes canals and household ponds seem secondary to temples. In the Maya lowlands, it makes settlement networks appear as isolated monuments. The jungle is real, powerful, and alive. But it's not always ancient wilderness in the simple sense. Some forests are old human landscapes transformed by regrowth. Some trees stand where people encouraged their ancestors. Some soils remain fertile because generations enriched them. Some animal paths follow old roads. To call such places untouched is to miss the hands that touched them first. At the same time, another modern myth runs in the opposite direction. The idea that every patch of jungle hides a vast city. That, too, is misleading. Responsible archaeology does not turn all mystery into empire. Many regions were lightly populated. Many societies were mobile, seasonal, small-scale, or organised in ways that left subtle traces. Some earthworks had ceremonial rather than residential functions. Some lidar patterns may belong to different centuries. Not one enormous city occupied all at once. Scholars still debate population estimates, dates, and functions at many sites. Wonder does not require exaggeration. The real discoveries are astonishing precisely because they are grounded roads where no roads were expected. Fields in wetlands once dismissed as empty. Cities whose full scale could not be seen from the ground. Forests that remember gardeners. The myths grew because the jungle is difficult to read, and because people often prefer a simple marvel to a complicated history. But the evidence asks for something better. It asks us to imagine ancient societies not as riddles waiting for fantasy, but as human worlds with politics, hunger, skill, belief, inequality, creativity, fear, and endurance. Their mysteries remain, but they are not empty mysteries. They are shaped by pottery, pollen, inscriptions, canals, terraces, charcoal, bones, seeds, roads, and living memory. The lost city of legend is usually less important than the lived landscape beneath it, and once that is understood, the jungle becomes stranger in a quieter way. It is not a curtain hiding treasure. It is a living archive, where the real story is harder to steal, harder to simplify, and far more worth hearing. The ruins beneath living worlds are never only ruins. They are also forests, villages, sacred places, research sites, tourist destinations, farmland, memories, and contested ground. A Maya temple under Kiba shade, a Khmer causeway crossing a field of rice. An Amazonian earthwork visible only when the canopy opens from above. Each belongs to the past, but none exists outside the present. People still walk around them, pray near them, farm beside them, guide visitors through them, protect them, damage them, argue over them, and inherit them in ways that cannot be measured by archaeology alone. The forgotten kingdoms beneath the jungle are not simply dead civilizations waiting for modern eyes. They are ancient landscapes still entangled with living ones. This is where the stories of the Maya, Anka, and Amazonia begin to speak to one another. They are not the same. Their languages, politics, environments, building materials, spiritual worlds, and historical endings differ enormously. The Maya lowland kingdoms carved dates and royal names in stone, raised temples above plazas, and depended on water storage in a seasonal limestone landscape. Angkor built a vast sacred and hydraulic capital, joining kingship, monsoon water, rice, roads, and temples into one of the largest urban experiments of the pre-industrial world. Amazonian societies often left subtler traces, shaping earth, forest, rivers, soils, and settlement networks without needing stone towers to prove their complexity. Yet all three show the same deeper truth. Civilization is not separate from landscape. It is a relationship with landscape, and relationships must be maintained. That maintenance is the quiet thread running beneath the grandeur. Reservoirs must be cleared, canals must be repaired, terraces must hold, roads must remain passable, fields must be planted at the right time, trees must be managed, water watched, soil renewed, labour organised, authority believed, and memory passed on. A city can look eternal when its temples are new, when its reservoirs are full, when its rulers speak confidently, when ceremonies fill the plaza, when trade goods arrive from far away. But beneath that appearance lies daily work. The most powerful kingdoms under the jungle were not held together by monuments alone. They were held together by repeated acts of care, obligation, and adaptation. When those acts became impossible, too costly, or no longer meaningful, the visible world began to loosen. No single explanation fully accounts for why such societies changed, declined, or were abandoned. Drought matters, but drought does not act alone. Warfare matters, but warfare is not always the beginning. Political rivalry, trade shifts, religious change, disease, migration, soil stress, flood, erosion, invasion, and choices made by ordinary families all enter the story. Collapse is a word that can be useful, but also dangerous. It can make complex transformation sound like a broken object hitting the ground. The record suggests something more uneven. A royal court may collapse while farmers continue nearby. A capital may lose power while a temple remains sacred. A region may empty after epidemic and violence while descendants survive elsewhere. A forest may grow over a city, yet the people connected to that city may not vanish at all. This is one of the most important corrections archaeology offers. The jungle did not swallow worlds because those worlds were foolish or doomed by nature. Many endured for centuries with remarkable intelligence. Maya farmers and engineers made seasonal landscapes productive. Khmer builders shaped water and stone at a scale that still astonishes. Amazonian communities created fertile earth and managed forests in ways modern science is only beginning to appreciate. Their failures, where failures occurred, were not failures of imagination. They were failures of systems under pressure, of political promises under strain, of environments changing faster or harder than institutions could answer, and in Amazonia, often of societies struck by diseases and colonial violence from beyond any world they had known. The legacy of these kingdoms is therefore not only warning, it is also instruction. They reveal how flexible human beings can be, how carefully they can read local environments, how many forms urban life can take, and how misleading it is to measure civilization only by stone, writing, or centralized empire. A forest garden can be as historical as a palace. A dark soil patch can be as meaningful as a royal monument. A canal choked with leaves can hold the memory of an entire political order. Scholars still debate population sizes, dates, functions, and causes at many sites, and the evidence remains incomplete, but the direction of discovery is clear. The jungle is no longer an empty backdrop. It is part archive, part witness, part participant. There is a humility in that realization. Modern societies often imagine themselves beyond the vulnerabilities of the past, because their cities are made of concrete, steel, electricity, and data rather than plaster, laterite, earth, and wood. Yet they still depend on water systems, food networks, climate patterns, labour, political trust, and maintenance. They still make promises their landscapes must help keep. They still build infrastructures that appear permanent until stress reveals their fragility. The old jungle kingdoms do not offer simple lessons, and it would be too easy to turn them into moral fables. But they do remind us that complexity brings both power and dependence. The larger the system, the more invisible work it requires. Beneath the leaves, the ruins continue to change. A root widens a crack, a stone settles, a reservoir fills with sediment, a carved face loses another grain of surface to rain. Archaeologists map, measure, preserve, and interpret. But preservation is never complete. Tourism brings money and danger. Farming reveals sites and sometimes destroys them. Climate change alters rainfall, fire risk, flooding, and vegetation. Looting removes objects from their meaning. Development cuts roads through old landscapes. The forgotten kingdoms are not safe simply because they have survived this long. Survival is not the same as protection. And yet, they remain. Tikal's towers still rise over the canopy at dawn. Angkor's moats still hold reflections. In Amazonia, dark earth still feeds roots, and old geometric forms still wait beneath grass and forest. These places endure not as frozen relics, but as living thresholds between human ambition and the more patient forces of the earth. They show that disappearance is rarely total, that memory can hide in mud and leaves, and that the past often survives in forms too quiet for people in a hurry to notice. The jungle covers kingdoms, but it also keeps them. It softens their edges, breaks their pride, feeds on their stones, and then, unexpectedly, returns their outlines to those willing to look carefully. After all the roads, reservoirs, temples, canals, mounds, gardens, and dark soils, the story settles back into the forest. The air is still warm. Rain gathers somewhere beyond the canopy. A bird calls from a branch rooted in the wall of a building whose builders no longer have names. The scene is not empty, and it is not entirely silent. It is filled with layers human hands, fallen leaves, sacred memory, broken power, returning growth. The forgotten kingdoms beneath the jungle ask for a slower kind of attention. They do not ask us to imagine one sudden vanishing, one treasure chamber, one perfect answer. They ask us to notice how civilizations live inside weather, soil, water, belief, labour, and time. They ask us to remember that what looks permanent may depend on delicate routines, and what looks wild may carry the imprint of generations. The forest is often described as a force that erases, but it also transforms. It turns plazas into clearings, reservoirs into ponds, roads into ridges, orchards into canopy, and royal centres into places where roots and stones share the same shade. In that transformation, something is lost, but something is also preserved. Not the old world as it was, bright with colour and noise and authority, but the outline of its passage through the earth. Long after the last court falls quiet, the landscape keeps working. Water finds old channels, seeds fall into old walls, animals cross old causeways. People return with maps, stories, offerings, questions, and sometimes only wonder. The jungle does not explain everything. It never gives back the full voice of the dead, but it leaves enough a line in the soil, a carved stair under moss, a dark patch of earth, a temple rising like a mountain of memory above the trees. And as evening lowers over the green world, The ruins seem less like endings than reminders. Civilizations rise by making agreements with their landscapes. They endure while those agreements hold. They fade when the promises break, but they do not vanish completely. Somewhere beneath leaves and rain, the old stones remain, waiting in the dim light, while the forest breathes around them.